After the Wehrmacht's defeat on the Seelow Heights along the banks of the Oder, the road to Berlin lay open. Between April 16th and 1945, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by Polish and Czech units, stormed the German positions shielding the capital. Despite the flooded dikes and the artillery batteries that Heinrich Himmler called the Eastern Wall, the heights gave way after 3 days of crushing bombardment and bloody hand-to-hand fighting. When the anti-aircraft searchlights went dark and the forests filled with smoke, red flags appeared on the hills. The ring around Berlin closed on April 25th. From then on, the city, an island of ruins hemmed in by rivers and marshes, awaited the final blow alone. In its basements and underground stations, millions of civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, listened to the roar of shells and wondered what their fate would be. The stories coming from the east were harrowing. In East Prussia and Silesia, refugees spoke of a wave of abuse and looting. Resistance propaganda and rumors spread by word of mouth about Red soldiers attacking girls of 8 and grandmothers of 80. The grim consolation of an imminent defeat was replaced by fear of an enemy who presented himself as a liberator but acted like a conqueror. As T-34 tanks crossed the outskirts and Katyusha rockets lit up the sky, Berlin became a city of women staring east in dread. The Nazi authorities had declared the capital a fortress, but its defenders were Volkssturm teenagers and old men armed with obsolete rifles. Joseph Goebbels issued grandiose orders from his bunker, while an endless line of refugees tried to flee toward the Elbe. Sailors of the Kriegsmarine deserted, SS officers burned documents, and mothers hid their daughters in attics and closets. This documentary delves into the period that followed that defeat. It is not another tale of the fall of Berlin as a military feat, but an attempt to give voice to the war's invisible victims. The question framing this story is, what did the Soviets do to German women after the Battle of Berlin? Welcome to Wartime Archive. From the Oder to the Spree, the final offensive. The story of Berlin's fall is best understood by examining the build-up that preceded the assault. After securing Königsberg and driving the last German divisions from East Prussia, Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev prepared an enveloping maneuver. In early April 1945, the First Belarusian Front massed 9 armies, with more than 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and tens of thousands of supply trucks on the Oder's banks. Behind them, endless trains hauled ammunition, food, and reserves, while engineers built pontoon bridges under enemy fire. The Luftwaffe could hardly interfere. Its last fighters were held back to defend the Reich's heart. At 3 in the morning on April 16th, 9,000 Soviet guns opened a barrage on the German positions. Artillery flashes and Katyusha rockets turned night into day. In the first 30 minutes, more than 500,000 shells were fired. When the batteries fell silent, the ground had become a field of smoking craters. Red Army soldiers then crossed the Oder in inflatable boats and over wooden bridges while sappers felt for mines with their bare hands. The initial resistance was ferocious. The German Ninth Army, a mix of veterans and teenagers, used the Seelow ridges as natural parapets, but the defenders could not withstand the attackers' overwhelming numbers and firepower. For 3 days, the hills thundered with rifle fire and grenades. Soviet divisions took massive casualties storming fortified positions, yet managed to outflank the Germans from the north and south. On April 18th, the defenses collapsed. Soviet tanks punched through the gaps. The remnants of the 9 Army were encircled, and Heinrich ordered a withdrawal toward Berlin. The bridges over the Spree and the Havel became funnels through which columns of refugees mingled with retreating soldiers. Roads were choked with wagons piled high with furniture, mattresses, and crying children. Every kilometer west bore witness to the dissolution of the Nazi state. The situation in the capital mirrored that disintegration. Of Berlin's 3 million remaining inhabitants, 2/3 were women. Many had endured the war with resignation, working in factories, tending hospitals, or sheltering in basements during air raids. Now, with the men gone, they assumed the defense of their homes. Goebbels ordered the population to fight to the last round, but most understood the outcome was inevitable. Some grabbed what little they had left and headed west, pushing handcarts and bicycles. Railway stations filled with stacks of suitcases, children asleep among exhausted women, and elderly people clutching pieces of bread. Accounts from refugees arriving from Königsberg and Gdansk fanned the terror. They told of Soviet soldiers bursting into villages, abusing women in front of their families and shooting those who tried to defend them. A phrase spread in hushed tones. "We oft? How many times?" A sign that each woman's integrity now depended less on morality than on luck. In that climate of fear, SS officers fled or hid under false identities. In the parks, members of the Hitler Youth dug trenches to build barricades as mothers watched with a mix of pride and despair. The machinery of the Reich was collapsing, and families prepared farewell letters. Some civilians resorted to arsenic or gas poisoning to avoid falling into enemy hands. In the last days of April, the first Soviet armored cars rolled into the suburbs. Berlin, which had endured 5 years of bombing, became a theater of house-to-house fighting, and as will be seen, the stage for a human tragedy that marked a generation. The besieged city, assault and dishonor. The Red Army's advance into Berlin turned the city into a maze of rubble and fear. Soviet columns entered from the northeast, defeated the defenders of Prenzlauer Berg, and pushed toward the Brandenburg Gate. The assault troops, accompanied by Mongolian and Caucasian units, were followed by rear-echelon detachments of quartermaster battalions, drivers, and replacement soldiers. It was in these less controlled units that violence became epidemic. Zakhar Agranenko, an officer and playwright, noted in his diary that the soldiers didn't believe in one-on-one encounters and abused in groups, laughing as they flaunted their power. Other witnesses described women being dragged by their braids and forced to lie in the mud while lines of men took turns with them. Some divisional staffs tried to halt the abuse. There are documented cases of officers shooting their own men when they caught them in the act. But such gestures were exceptional and did not change the overall course of events. The capital's hospitals became improvised havens for victims. Doctors and nuns treated women with tears, fractures, hemorrhages, and bite wounds. Within weeks, clinics reported tens of thousands of assaults. Major medical centers estimated that between 95,000 and 130,000 women were abused in Berlin in the spring of 1945 alone. A figure supported by physicians' accounts that at least 10,000 died as a result, many by suicide or subsequent infections. In churches, some priests heard confessions and tried to console the victims, but were powerless to stop the violence. Parish archives contain accounts of entire families who poisoned themselves together to avoid violation. The violence spared neither age nor social standing. Girls of 8 and women of 80 were attacked. A Nazi official's pregnant wife received the same treatment as a refugee peasant. In some neighborhoods, the few young women who remained tried to disguise themselves as men by cutting their hair and wearing loose clothes. Elsewhere, mothers hid daughters in trunks or wall cavities. Nuns at a convent in Lichtenberg hung a sign that read, "Only elderly and sick women here," hoping to deter soldiers. Even so, the convent was stormed and several sisters were abused. The case of Dieter Saul, a 13-year-old who hurled himself at a soldier to stop the attack on his mother and was shot dead, summed up the Berliners' helplessness. No one was safe. The pattern repeated in every district. Groups of drunken men burst into basements where entire families sheltered, picked out the women, and hauled them upstairs. Often a mother was abused in front of her husband, or the father was forced to hold a flashlight. When they were done, the soldiers took watches, rings, and bottles of wine. Some spat on the victims or urinated on them, as though humiliation were part of the loot. There were reports of mutilations and torture, soldiers forcing batons or bottles into women's bodies or threatening them with grenades to make them lie still. A British newspaper quoted a witness who saw a Soviet soldier spit into a woman's mouth during the assault, a gesture that encapsulated the blend of pleasure and contempt. The scale of the abuse appears in hundreds of diaries recovered decades later. A Jewish nurse who had survived Auschwitz wrote that on the night of May 1st, Her basement was raided by 12 men shouting, "Occupation," who assaulted her in turn while her grandmother prayed. Another young woman noted that a Soviet soldier spat into her mouth during the attack, which she read as a sign of absolute disdain. A mother recounted offering her daughters disguised as boys to keep them from being separated. When the soldier discovered the ruse, he killed the son and assaulted the girl beside the corpse. These accounts show improvisation and despair. Each family devised its own way to resist, knowing any plan could fail. Hospitals faced a deluge. Many professionals had fled or died in the bombings, leaving improvised clinics overwhelmed. According to internal records, 90% of the women treated had some venereal infection. Medicines and antibiotics were scarce. Childbirth proved deadly for wounded or infected mothers. Many died hours after delivery. A Berlin doctor reported that of the 100,000 abused women his team treated, 10,000 died, most from deliberate poisoning or uncontrollable bleeding. The violence was not confined to Berlin. In Germany's eastern provinces, especially East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the numbers were even higher. Historians estimate that more than 1 million women were abused in those regions during the Soviet offensive and occupation. Some were attacked dozens of times. There are testimonies of women assaulted by 60 or 70 soldiers in a single night. In cities like Danzig, Breslau, and Gdynia, soldiers looted liquor stores and launched into what one officer called a revenge party. The term reflects how perpetrators saw it: abuse as a right after 4 years of war and hunger. The absence of local police or competent authority worsened matters. Town halls were abandoned and Nazi militias had dissolved. The pattern was repeated in Austria and Hungary. In Vienna, between 70,000 and 100,000 women were abused in the first months of occupation. The attacks did not subside until Soviet military police were organized and joint patrols with Allied soldiers were put in place. The magnitude and brutality of the abuses committed by Soviet troops were unique in Europe. While soldiers of other nations also committed abuses, the French-Moroccan tirailleurs were responsible for attacks in Baden and Württemberg, and cases were recorded in areas occupied by US and British forces. No other force matched the combination of scale, violence, and cruelty documented during the Soviet advance. This specificity makes the events in Berlin one of the largest episodes of mass abuse in modern history. Vengeance, propaganda, and disciplinary chaos. Understanding why so many soldiers took part in these crimes requires examining the cultural and psychological context of total war. The first factor was vengeance. Since June 1941, Soviet territory had been ravaged by German invaders. The Wehrmacht and the SS destroyed towns, burned villages, murdered millions of civilians, and left a trail of ruins as far as Stalingrad. When the Red Army counterattacked, thousands of soldiers had lost their families. Many, upon liberating towns, discovered that their mothers, sisters, or wives had been killed or abused by German soldiers. A letter found in the pocket of a dead Russian near Kustrin captured this sentiment. "Brothers, remember our violated mother. Do not forget our murdered sister. Make the Germans pay for every tear." Such an eye-for-an-eye mentality permeated the ranks. Soviet propaganda, spread by journalists like Ilya Ehrenburg, reinforced the thirst for revenge. Ehrenburg even wrote, "Kill the German, at least one a day." There's nothing we enjoy more than piling up German corpses. Although the authorities later moderated such slogans, the damage was done. The enemy was dehumanized and violence justified. The second factor was alcohol. In the days before the assault on Berlin, the Nazis made a fatal mistake. They did not destroy liquor cellars in the eastern cities. Soviet soldiers found reserves of vodka, cognac, and wine beyond anything seen at home. Witnesses recalled truckloads of alcohol being looted and consumed within hours. A Ukrainian mechanic recounted that a single assault involved 20 men completely drunk. The attack was so brutal the victim, a 14-year-old girl, was traumatized for life. A Russian diary found after the war lamented that had there not been so much alcohol, perhaps half the assaults would never have occurred. Drink dulled morals and multiplied violence. The third factor was the patriarchal structure and entrenched machismo of Soviet society and its republics. In many rural regions, violating the enemy's women was seen as a display of virile power. This archaic tradition, combined with state discourse that cast German women as responsible for the war's horrors, provided a powerful justification for humiliation. Added to this was the Stalinist regime's sexual repression. Official morality condemned any sexuality outside marriage, so many soldiers had gone years in abstinence. In the absence of brothels or a leave system, troops channeled their frustration into the occupied population. The fourth factor was discipline. The Red Army lacked an effective justice system to respond to crime within its ranks. Although the Soviet military code prohibited abuse and looting, the chain of command was lax. Many officers were as traumatized or as steeped in the spirit of vengeance as their men, and preferred to look the other way. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky tried to curb abuses with Order No. 006, urging that hatred be directed at the enemy in combat and forbidding mistreatment of civilians. The order was largely ignored. When Yugoslav envoy Milovan Djilas reproached Stalin for his troops' conduct, the dictator replied, "A soldier who has traveled thousands of kilometers through blood and fire deserves to have some fun." Whether uttered or not, the phrase sums up the permissiveness at the top. Only when the abuses began to affect the troops' health and discipline were measures taken. By mid-1945, the NKVD started prosecuting perpetrators. Some were summarily shot, others sent to gulags. At least 4,148 officers and thousands of soldiers were convicted for crimes committed in Germany, though these figures are negligible compared with the scale of the offenses. Historians argue that most punishments were meted out when the victims were not German but Soviet or Polish. The order confining troops to barracks from the winter of 1947-48 was the most effective step to reduce violence. It banned contact with civilians and harshly punished transgressors. By then, however, millions of women had been assaulted, and the damage was irreparable. Researchers like Norman Neymark have noted that the abuses were not homogeneous. Rear echelon units, drivers, sappers, and logistics troops accounted for much of the aggression. Russian historians such as Alexander Rozhishevsky have minimized the extent of these atrocities, arguing that the German population deserved to suffer. Neymark maintains that violence was exacerbated by the Red Army's diversity. Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Georgians, and Armenians served alongside Russians and Ukrainians, and often regarded looting and assault as spoils of war. Yet, there are also testimonies of Soviet soldiers who risked their lives to protect women and punish abusers, showing the violence was not unanimous. It must be stressed that not all soldiers took part in these crimes. Some fighters were ashamed of their comrades, helped women escape, or offered them shelter. One veteran recounted how his squad adopted a 10-year-old girl whose family had been massacred, protecting her until she could be handed to the Red Cross. Another said there were no abuses in his company because the men had sweethearts back home and wrote letters daily. These exceptions show that violence was not inevitable, but the product of a specific context of propaganda, trauma, and lack of control. Acknowledging the range of behaviors does not excuse barbarity, but it helps to understand its historical dimension. Survival and forced cohabitation. As Soviet troops occupied neighborhoods and villages, German women developed strategies to survive the assaults. The first was hiding. In the weeks before the Soviets arrived, many families bricked up basements, dug tunnels, or built secret compartments behind wardrobes. Girls cut their hair, smeared soot on their faces, and wore boys' clothing to pass as children. Some nuns disguised patients in their hospitals with habits to make them look like religious sisters. This camouflage saved some, but not most. Once soldiers began house-to-house searches, hiding places were discovered. The second strategy was individual protection. Women of all social classes attached themselves to a single soldier to avoid group assaults. They chose someone they considered less brutal, cooked for him, shared his bed, and in return received food and a degree of protection from other men. Diaries tell how these relationships shifted from coercion to dependence. Some women developed affection for their protectors and grew jealous when they were away. Some soldiers wanted their German partners to return with them to the Soviet Union. These occupation wives were tolerated at first, but soon became a problem for the Soviet command, which saw discipline eroding. When, in 1948, troops were ordered back to barracks, many of these bonds were abruptly severed, leaving women with children who would never know their fathers. A third mechanism was barter. With warehouses destroyed and the food supply collapsed, sex became currency. Soldiers paid with tins of meat, chocolate, soap, or cigarettes. Women needed such goods to feed their families. The line between abuse and prostitution blurred. Accepting a trade was sometimes a way to stay alive. Informal markets sprang up in the squares of Neukölln and Moabit, where arrangements were negotiated. A packet of coffee could buy a night of safety. Chroniclers tell of a young woman who gave up her shoes to obtain an antibiotic that saved her sick mother. Barter allowed some to survive, but deepened dependence on the occupiers. At the same time, then networks of solidarity among women emerged. Neighbors organized night watches. One would bang on a pipe if she saw soldiers approaching, and all would flee to the nearest shelter. In some districts, codes were created. 3 knocks meant take cover. 4, they've entered the building. Older women, deemed less desirable, volunteered themselves to save the younger ones. Churches and convents served as refuges despite repeated raids. In hospitals, nurses formed circles around patients to shield them. These actions showed that even in utter desperation, there was room for solidarity and resistance. A fourth means of survival was mobility. Thousands of women chose to leave Berlin before or during the fighting. They walked hundreds of kilometers west with their children, crossing icy rivers and mined fields. Many were captured by Soviet patrols or killed in air raids. Yet a significant number reached areas controlled by the Western Allies, such as Magdeburg or Hanover, where violence was less intense. These escapes show the victims were not all passive. Some chose uncertain routes to avoid assault. Forced cohabitation left complex emotional scars. In some homes, the assigned soldier ended up providing sustenance and defending the family from other Soviets. Women developed ambivalent relationships that alternated between gratitude and fear. When the soldiers departed, some experienced a kind of grief. They had depended on their aggressor to survive and now were left unprotected. Such bonds complicated later moral judgments. The line between victim and collaborator proved difficult for German society to draw. Women devised ever more sophisticated alarm codes. Some wedged spoons into window frames so they would rattle at the slightest knock. Others hung bells on doors and took turns keeping watch. On a street in Pankow, neighbors agreed that 3 knocks on the wall signaled soldiers approaching. The response was immediate. Young women ran to the attics, and older ones feigned fainting to distract them. The clergy played an ambiguous role. Some parishes hid women among the pews, while others feared Soviet retaliation. So-called occupation marriages arose. A soldier settled in a home in exchange for food and protection, born of coercion. These ties became more complex as women began to depend on their aggressors to survive. Solidarity also involved doctors and midwives who performed clandestine abortions. A gynecologist at the Charité documented more than 200 procedures in secret. Their work saved thousands of lives and remained unspoken for decades. Despite the ingenuity of these strategies, none could fully shield against trauma. The memory of boots on the stairs, the reek of alcohol, and neighbors' screams was etched into collective memory. Many women remained silent for decades. Others wrote diaries and hid them under floorboards. Recovered years later, these writings reveal the human scale of the horror and offer irreplaceable testimony of everyday resistance to brutality. Bodies and souls, the aftermath of invasion. The wave of abuse left a legacy of pain imprinted on bodies and minds. One of the most immediate consequences was pregnancy. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of women conceived as a result of the assaults. In Berlin, roughly 4% of children born in 1946 had Soviet fathers, according to hospital statistics. Many mothers opted for clandestine abortions, risking their lives. Others abandoned newborns at church doors or orphanages. Some families raised those children in secret, concealing their origins. Violence thus became the starting point of countless lives marked by brutality and shame. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases was another open wound. Berlin hospitals recorded that up to 90% of abused women presented with syphilis, gonorrhea, or other infections. Penicillin was scarce and prohibitively expensive on the black market. Many could not obtain it and suffered lifelong complications. Doctors noted that thousands of women died from post-operative infections after unsafe abortions or from poisoning after ingesting toxic substances to terminate pregnancies. The unhygienic conditions of shelters, lack of clean water, and poor nutrition worsened the situation. Concerned about disease spreading in their own ranks, Soviet authorities began monitoring prostitutes and confining sick soldiers, but these measures came late. Psychological trauma was perhaps the most enduring consequence. Many victims suffered post-traumatic stress, nightmares, and panic attacks. In an era when psychology was viewed with suspicion, most locked their memories away. An estimated 10% of abused women in Berlin died by suicide. Others sought refuge in religion or alcohol. Some developed an aversion to sex and never again were intimate with their husbands. Others could not accept children born of violence. Social stigma was so strong that many victims never told their families. When they tried to speak, they were accused of exaggeration or blamed for provoking the soldiers. The consequences extended beyond individual health. The violence of 1945 created a generational void. Thousands of men felt humiliated for failing to protect their wives, sisters, or daughters. Some responded with domestic violence. Others abandoned their families. Distrust between genders deepened. In rural areas, abused women were shunned by their communities and lost marriage prospects. The presence of mixed heritage children challenged the Nazi ideal of racial purity, forcing society to confront its internal racism. These children, derisively called Little Russians, grew up with hybrid identities and often with an absent father. Beyond Germany, abuses committed by Soviet soldiers also left marks. In Austria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, thousands of women suffered similar assaults. In some Polish towns, residents organized self-defense militias to protect their sisters and mothers, while in Hungary, the communist authorities imprisoned those who denounced soldiers. Doctors treating victims testified to a wave of syphilis and abortions that overwhelmed hospitals. Although in these countries the memory of mass abuse was not as silenced as in Germany, the subject remained taboo for decades. The violence also had a demographic impact. Many historians hold that at least 240,000 German women died as a result of the assaults and their consequences, through suicide, disease, or medical complications. Adding this toll to the war's direct victims shows that the conflict's end did not bring peace to everyone. The abuses also reshaped family structures. Young widows and war orphans formed the base of a new generation tasked with rebuilding the country. Many abused women were institutionalized in psychiatric hospitals, where they remained until their deaths without adequate care. The trauma of 1945 cut across generations. Daughters grew up with wounded mothers, nightmares, and a silence palpable at family meals. Mixed heritage sons were sent to orphanages or emigrated to the Soviet Union. Some sought their fathers in the 1960s and found only evasions or denials. Granddaughters, upon discovering hidden diaries, spurred mental health studies showing that the suicide rate among women assaulted in 1945 was double the national average. Demographers estimate that the total number of deaths linked to the assaults, suicides, dangerous abortions, and diseases may have exceeded 240,000, compared with Austria and Hungary, where later mortality was lower thanks to functioning hospitals. Germany's tragedy stands out. These comparisons also recall that thousands of Soviet women were assaulted by their own comrades upon returning from the front, an obscured episode underscoring the systemic nature of wartime violence. Morally, trauma was compounded by the impossibility of reporting crimes. In East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party celebrated the Red Army as liberator, and banned any mention of the abuses. Victims who spoke out were accused of Western propaganda. In West Germany, society was absorbed by denazification, economic reconstruction, and integration with the West. Acknowledging women as victims could seem like an attempt to equate German suffering with the Holocaust. Thus, the violence of 1945 became an open secret. Women hid their pain to avoid shaming their families, and the country rebuilt itself on a foundation of silences. Decades later, the effects endure. Daughters and granddaughters discover letters and diaries revealing a reality the official history had buried. They find in Marta Hiller's collected accounts or in research by historians such as Helke Sander a mirror of their family trauma. By speaking about these matters, women broke a cycle of intergenerational shame and asserted a right to memory. The pain of 1945 therefore extends beyond medical and psychological realms. It is woven into the identity of a nation, still struggling to reconcile its contradictions. Fragmented memory, justice, and oblivion. After the summer of 1945, the violence began to subside, but it did not disappear. From autumn onward, Soviet authorities, alarmed by disease spreading among their troops and by popular anger, began to make examples of some perpetrators. The NKVD arrested hundreds of soldiers, especially when the victims were of Allied nationalities. Even so, most offenders were never brought to account. When the winter of 1947 arrived, the Soviet military administration confined soldiers to barracks and restricted leave to visit cities. Abuses dropped sharply, but the Red Army's reputation was already tarnished among Germans. In the years that followed, silence prevailed for political reasons. In the German Democratic Republic, the official narrative presented the Soviets as heroes. The party forbade any investigation into the violence and censored publications that mentioned it. Schools taught that the Soviet communist woman had liberated Germany from fascism. Many victims internalized this discourse and repressed their memories. Only within their homes did they dare speak of the horror. In the Federal Republic, the climate was little better. West German society was immersed in denazification, economic reconstruction, and integration with the West. Speaking about the abuses could seem like diluting German guilt or diverting attention from the Holocaust. Dissenting voices nevertheless emerged. In 1956, journalist Gabriele Koppel published a pioneering article on Berlin, Women Abused by Soviet Soldiers, but she was attacked as a revisionist. In 1969, Austrian historian Kurt von Schuschnigg wrote an essay on assaults in Vienna. Even so, historiography remained scattered and marginal. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the opening of archives in Moscow, the debate changed. Historians such as Antony Beevor and Norman Neymark gained access to Soviet General Staff documents and war diaries. They published works that not only quantified the number of assaults, but analyzed their causes and consequences. These publications, translated into several languages, caused scandal in Russia. Kremlin officials branded the authors slanderers. Libraries pulled books. Soviet publishers refused translations. Outside Russia, however, the research was recognized and contributed to a broader debate on violence and war. Judicially, there have been few attempts at redress. Soviet courts punished some perpetrators in 1945 and 1946. Polish and East German courts tried soldiers for other crimes, but assault was rarely the main charge. In 2000, a group of German historians submitted a report to the Bundestag requesting official recognition for the victims of the 1945 abuses. Parliament thanked the study, but approved no compensation. In 2006, the European Court of Human Rights rejected a collective lawsuit by descendants seeking reparations from Russia, arguing the crimes were time-barred. Despite the paucity of trials, memory has found other paths. The Anonymous Diary, A Woman in Berlin, written by Marta Hillers, was published in the United States in 1955 and met fierce criticism in Germany for portraying German women as victims. Only after its 2003 republication and its 2008 film adaptation was it recognized as a valuable testimony. In Russia, Writer Svetlana Alexievich interviewed Red Army veterans who described their comrades' violence in her book, The Unwomanly Face of War. These voices show that some Soviets were horrified by what they saw and heard. Today, museums and memory institutes in Berlin organize exhibitions on the abuses of 1945. They document letters, photographs, and oral testimonies. In German schools, the topic is discussed in contemporary history classes. Some feminist organizations have created spaces for survivors to share experiences. The debate, however, remains divided. In Russia, many consider that denouncing the abuses insults the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. In Poland and the Baltic states, the events are remembered as part of Soviet oppression. Germany, for its part, tries to balance the memory of its guilt with recognition of its citizens' suffering. The legacy of Red Army abuses after the Battle of Berlin is thus fragmented. There are no official monuments to the assaulted women, nor trials that have restored their honor. Their story lives in books, letters, and accounts passed down in families. The question, what did the Soviets do to German women after the Battle of Berlin, has no single answer, but it invites recognition that behind the rightful celebration of victory over Nazism lay a massive, systematic crime. Telling these stories with objectivity and without sensationalism honors the victims and helps ensure that, in future wars, violence is not hidden behind anthems and flags.